mobility presentation from Chuck Marohn, and we're so excited and pleased to have our Strong Towns person here with us today. Mr. Kelly?
Yeah, well, it's a short presentation. Chuck Marohn, founder of Strong Towns. I think most of you all are familiar. He's been around here. He's got familiarity with what we're facing here in West Palm Beach, and we had quite a conversation this morning, and I think a takeaway that I got from the conversation is, sometimes we fret and worry about what's going on, but when you're from the outside, you really can really appreciate what has been going on here and what potential this city has. So I'd really appreciate him coming and being able to help give us more guidance in regard to how we move forward. So, Chuck?
Thank you. It's very, very nice to be here. Last week I gave a presentation, gave testimony at the North Dakota legislature, which is a totally different temperature and degree, but same kind of concept. My name's Chuck Marohn. I'm a planner and an engineer. I actually am from central Minnesota. I worked for a number of years doing engineering work. Yeah, you don't want people to fall asleep. For cities all over Minnesota, and felt I was a very bad engineer. I asked too many questions, and the projects I was working on didn't make a lot of sense to me. A lot of times when I would ask questions, the answer that I got was, well, that's the way that we do things, Chuck. That's the way they've always been done. I went back to graduate school and got a planning degree. In engineering school, we make jokes about planners, and in planning school, we make jokes about engineers. Mm-hmm. And they're both equally funny for very different reasons. I got a planning degree and started working in a lot of these same cities, and struggled. My idea was that I could help correct some of the problems that we were doing in the engineering profession by doing better planning. And what ended up at the end of the day is I realized that the finance kind of dominates the entire conversation. I would be doing planning work, working with the engineering team, and it always seemed at the end of the day that it was where we can get the money, who's walking in the door with a project. It was always the finance that governed. And I think my kind of tipping point of frustration, we were in my hometown shutting the streetlights off overnight because we didn't have the money to keep them on. We were furloughing employees. We were laying off police officers and firefighters. We had closed our library early. We moved up the closing time. I have two daughters who just love going to the library. No, sorry, it's closed. We were doing all these things just to pinch pennies. And at the same time, we were doing a project that was the size, equal in size to our entire city budget. We were doing that to widen out a shortcut around the south side of town, a little road that when I was a kid we used to take to, gravel, cut 2 minutes off of our time going around the south side of town. We were turning that into a 4-lane, divided, wide, paved, kind of redundant street. And the question was, how do we have the money to do that, but we can't do these things that seem so critical and important to who we are and what we want to be? Why can we find $9 million? I'm from a very small town. Why can we find $9 million to do this project over here, and we couldn't find $500 to paint this crosswalk? Like, why is that? And so I started to ask a different set of questions, questions about really why our cities were struggling financially. And in 2008, I started to write about this. Writing, as you know, is a very self-organizing kind of thing. When you talk about something, you have all kinds of ideas. When you have to sit and write them down, it makes them more concrete. It forces you to think through things. I started to write about this. People started to read what I wrote. It started to get passed around. And in a couple years, some friends of mine helped me start a nonprofit organization. I've been doing that ever since. So today I'm going to give you a little bit of presentation. I've changed some things based on our conversations today and also just my experiences here. And I want to say, much like I did last week with the legislature, we've got an hour and change. I'm going to talk. When I get going, I can talk for 4 hours. If there's things you want to stop and pause and mill over, just let's make this more of a conversation than a lecture, if you would. Our mission, support a model of development that allows our cities, towns, and neighborhoods to become financially strong and resilient. I want to start with Lafayette, Louisiana, because this is actually the most in-depth study that I've ever seen done on the finances of a city. And I think it's indicative of what we see in every city really in North America. Lafayette was struggling much in the ways that my city was struggling, just to pay the bills. Their mayor, who was term limited out, asked us to come to town and help him. He was under a lot of pressure from the chamber and others to follow in the tradition of other mayors and raise taxes in your last 2 years in office. In Louisiana, you can't raise taxes at all, except when you're leaving, then you have a mandate to raise taxes. They wanted him to raise taxes and spend money building more highways and roadways for growth reasons. They had a $50 million backlog of road maintenance, and if they tripled their road maintenance budget, the backlog would still continue to grow every year. So this is a huge problem. He didn't really understand it, and they couldn't really explain it, so they asked us to come to town and take a look at it. We went through every expense the city had and every revenue stream the city had, and we mapped them all together. One of the maps that we came across in looking at our data was very illustrative. It was a 1949 water system map. So it laid out what the city's water system looked like in 1959 or 1949, right at kind of the beginning of this new way they went about building this very hyper-horizontal expansion of the city. In 1949, their city population was a little over 33,000. Today, it is 121,000. They've grown by 3.5 times since then. When we looked at their water system on this map, what we saw is that in 1949, they had 5 feet of pipe per person. Today, that number is 50, so 10 times the amount. And if you think about that from an engineering perspective, a family of 4 back in 1949, the excess wealth of that family was expected to take care of the maintenance of 20 feet of pipe. Today, the excess wealth of a family is expected to take care of 200 feet of pipe. That's how much it takes for a family of 4 to function in the city. When we looked at fire hydrants, we saw a similar kind of trend. 2.4 hydrants per 1,000 people back in 1949. Now it is 51.3, so 21 times. When we look at this, we see they grew their population by 3.5. They grew their liabilities by between 10 and 20 times. When we actually looked at their wealth, how much money people make, how much wealth they actually have to make good on these obligations, the median household income's only gone up by 1.6 times.
And this is still Lafayette?
This is still Lafayette, Louisiana. And I adjusted the 1950s for inflation. It was a lot lower in real dollar terms, but in today's dollars, that's what it was. What we see, and we see this in city after city after city, is that it takes more and more and more input to get a fractional amount of output. We have to commit to more and more length of pipe, more and more length of road, more and more length of sidewalk for each increment of growth we experience in this model, in this approach. And there is not just diminishing returns to this, the returns actually very quickly become negative. That was one of the things we recognized early on at Strong Towns. I went out and I looked at developments that I had worked on, and I started to do the math on them. Why are we going broke? What does our developments tell us about the answer to that question? So this is a dead-end cul-de-sac. This is actually a street that I worked on. There's just residential homes along here with a paved road and a dead-end cul-de-sac. I knew how much this road cost. I knew how much tax revenue they were getting from the people on this road. So I just mashed the two together and said, okay, The city paid for half this road. Based on the taxes they're collecting, how long is it going to take them to recoup the amount they spent to build it? The answer is 37 years. The road's not going to last 37 years. But it's going to take the city to recoup that amount. When it's got to be fixed, where's that money going to come from? It's not coming from these people here. It's going to have to come from someplace else. Here's another development. This one is a residential system, closed loop, dead-end cul-de-sac. There's no through traffic, no commercial traffic. The only reason this road exists is because of the houses that are there. If there were no homes there, you wouldn't have a road. This was built in the 80s. A developer paid for everything, essentially, rolled the cost of building all that infrastructure into the sale of the lots. People have been including that in their property values, paying that on their mortgages. At the same time, they pay taxes to the city to maintain all this. The city went out and fixed it because the road had fallen apart. It was $354,000. We asked the question, based on the taxes that the city collects from the people in this development, how long is it going to take them to recoup what they had to spend to fix it? The answer is 79 years. Let's pretend that, because the road won't last anywhere near that long, let's pretend the city wanted to collect enough money from these people between now and the time their road fell apart to actually have the money to go out and fix it. What would that mean? It would mean an immediate 46% increase in taxes, annual increases of 3% over inflation forever, with all that money going just to maintain the roadway. The sewer, the water, the storm sewer, all vastly more expensive than the roadway. What we found is that our post-World War II development experiences a very familiar kind of pattern everywhere we look. What we see is that when cities experience growth in this way, and I'll just pause here and say, in Florida, it's even crazier because of the very volatile way you've structured your development fees and really the running of your governments based largely on growth and transactions. Those of you that were around in 2009, 2010, remember how difficult things were. It's because you have a hyper-volatile system. When things are good, it magnifies to the upside. When things are bad, it magnifies to the downside. It's a very volatile system. In a not-so-volatile system, here's the kind of thing we see. And so you can just take yours and like make it higher and lower. When a developer goes in and builds a new development, or when there's some type of grant approach, however we make these public investments, what we see is that right away the cost to the government is very low. And in fact, you here get impact fees and development fees with a lot of your developments. So your costs are not only non-existent, but your revenue is even higher. But what we see is that the cost of actually maintaining this stuff, going out and fixing the road, going out and fixing the pipe, going out and maintaining the sidewalk, that is a generation away. So for a generation, we've got money coming in, money coming in, money coming in, and a promise that sits way out there. If you look at this from a cash flow standpoint, you're all sitting here, in those early years of the development, everything looks great. We've got money coming in, we've got no expenses. That 5-year-old road isn't costing us anything. That 10-year-old sidewalk isn't costing us anything. That 15-year-old pipe isn't costing us anything. But when we get out to the end and we have to actually go out and make good on the promises that we've made to the public, that we will fix and maintain this infrastructure, we will service this stuff, we will take care of it, what we find is that the amount of money we brought in over the haul of doing it is not enough to actually make good on that promise. And we run far into the negative. When cities are growing, so this is this same development, but repeated over and over and over. When cities are growing, what we see is that the cash actually accelerates upward. And when you get to the end of those early projects, because you're having a lot of growth, you've got money available. You can essentially rob Peter to pay Paul. You've got cash there, so you can make good on things. But the problem is, the further you go out in time, when you lose money on every project that you do, the further you go out in time, the more downward pressure there is on your budget. The more these liabilities start to add up. The more they start to overwhelm you. This is what we saw in Lafayette when we looked and said, well, you experienced decades of growth, decades where things felt prosperous, decades where you had lots of money, and now all of a sudden you're overwhelmed with liabilities. Why? Because in those early years you were over here, and now you're way, way, way over here. all those promises have started to catch up to you. One of the problems we have and one of the things we struggle with is we start to associate the good times with the growth. We start to associate when things were easy with this period of time here. But the reason they were easy is because we were taking on liabilities. We were taking on promises. We were promising. Anyone who runs a business can tell you, I can make the balance sheet look good today if I'm willing to sacrifice a decade or two from now. We have set up a development system at the federal level for states, at the state level for our cities, at the county level, at the city level, that gives us a massive incentive to build and grow in a not financially viable way today, because we experience the success of that now. But we experience the pain with that way out into the future. The problem we have is we're in the future of yesterday. We're dealing with that now. A lot of the struggles that we have financially with making good on all these promises, with making good on all these obligations, and I'd like to talk about some of the things that are going on out in the county as well, because the county is experiencing this in a way that even you are not, in kind of a crazy, crazy way. Come directly from this trade-off. And by the way, let's just pause here and point out, we see this everywhere across the country. This is not a left-of-center problem. This is not a right-of-center problem from a political standpoint. This is not a failing you see in blue states. This is not a failing you see in red states. This is not an urban or a suburban problem. This is a human failing. If you study psychology, psychologists call this temporal discounting. As humans, we are wired to highly value positive things today and to deeply, deeply discount negative feedback in the future. It's why people smoke. It's why people don't exercise, have too many snacks, sit in front of the TV. You know, heart disease will never happen to me, right? And then you wind up way out here. You're like, oh, I wish I had taken better care of myself in my 30s and 20s, what have you. This is a natural human failing. We all experience this. So in a sense, this problem doesn't fit our political narrative, our way of talking about this, our way of constructing this, our way of actually dealing with this. This is a much deeper, much more human kind of struggle. There's some huge implications for all this. When we grow, and when I step back and look at the West Palm Beach, the region around you, and I look at Southern Florida in general as like a hyper example of this, the more we experience growth in this way, the poorer we become. The more we grow, the more we have immediate cash, but the poorer ultimately we become. We are now forcing our cities to deal with the costs of their own development pattern. If you look at the president's budget that came out last week, you look at the infrastructure plan that came out last week, what you see is a shift from the federal government to local governments. Back in the 60s, when we were building highways for the first time, the federal government paid 95% of the cost. As things started to age and we were building different parts of the system, that shifted down to 80% of the cost. The new infrastructure plan actually says instead of the federal government paying 80% and cities paying 20% and local governments paying 20%, we're going to flip that. The federal government will now pay 20% and you will pay 80%. That changes everything. And all of those liabilities that we assume that someone else would take care of are all of a sudden coming due to us. If we want that pipe fixed, we're going to have to pay for that. If we want that street repaired, that money is going to have to come from us. This cannot happen in the current pattern of development without some massive tax increases and or some devastatingly large cuts in services. And this gets back to that Lafayette question. Why are we going broke? How do we deal with this? And the mayor actually said to us, I realize that if I were to raise taxes now, it wouldn't really solve anything. The amount that I can raise, the amount that I would raise it may give us some money to do a project here or a project there, but it's not going to touch this $50 million backlog. And that backlog is growing by millions every year. We're not getting there. It's important to see the third variable in that sentence, the current pattern of development. When we build in the way that we do, when we go about arranging things on the landscape the way we arrange them, there's no amount of tax increase, there's no amount of service cut that can solve that fundamental underlying insolvency problem. This is where, and I want to go back in history a little bit, but I'm going to offer you kind of a bit of encouragement, because the actual city of West Palm Beach, in this morass of I think, governments that are struggling and are going to continue to struggle, you are the ones that are best positioned to actually succeed. You're the ones who actually have great bones, great neighborhoods, a great downtown, and a pathway to success that I think this region is going to desperately need in the future. When we look at the way cities have grown historically, and you can, this is from my part of the world, this is central Minnesota, you can transpose your own part of the world because it actually architecturally would be different, the vegetation is different, but the approach is very much the same. If we go back to the early settlements in Florida, what you see is that they started with little pop-up shacks. Over time, as things were more successful, cities would grow incrementally up, incrementally out, and they become incrementally more intense. So you would get buildings and developments that were more intense. Over time, things would become more intense yet, and you would get buildings that were more finished, greater levels of investment. Cities would grow incrementally up, incrementally out, and in place become incrementally more intense. And this is a pattern we see all over the world, every continent, every latitude, every culture. For thousands and thousands of years, we see the same style of development, the incremental improvement over time. This is a marked contrast to the way we build today. If you think about, go way out on the edge of the community and think about a brand new residential subdivision. High-end homes, built in a, all at once within a development. You'll come in and you'll get a plat and you'll go out, and within 3 or 4 years the entire development will be built out and all those developments sold. And then we have this huge amount of tax base with this underlying liability sitting there that's going to come due a generation from now. Let's fast forward a generation. What happens? Well, not only does the government have to go out and fix that street, not only do we have to go out and repair that pipe, repair that sidewalk, those curbs, the valves and the meters and all those things are starting to age and we've got to fix them. But what's going on with the development? Well, all of a sudden now, because these homes were built within 2-3 years of each other, at the same time, everybody's roof goes bad. Everybody's siding goes bad at the same time. Everybody's appliances need to be fixed at the same time. Everybody's sidewalk, everybody's driveway, all of this goes bad at the same time. So what we see in that way that I showed you earlier, we see this huge, spike in prosperity and success, followed by this massive drop-off all at once across a wide scale. This is not the way cities are successful. The way cities are successful is this incremental development pattern. Got a little bit going on here, a little bit going on there, and we raise the wealth and the value of the place, and that creates a natural renewal mechanism. If you look at the great parts of your downtown, what you see is that the underlying land value is really high. And it's growing higher all the time because your town, your city is being very successful in building and developing, particularly in the core downtown. As those land values go up, what kind of pressure does that put on the development? The pressure for the development is to do what? To become more intense. To take older buildings that are in disrepair and bring them up to a higher standard. This is the way successful cities have grown for literally thousands of years. When we look at this development pattern, we can get a sense of how productive and how successful it is. These are 2 examples from my hometown, but I've seen the same kind of numbers in your part of the world. These are 2 identical blocks. The one on the left I've labeled old and blighted, the one on the right I've labeled shiny and new. If you look at them, they're the same size, the same area, they've got the same amount of public infrastructure. If we look at that old blighted block, it is run down, it is neglected, it is junky. It was built in the 1920s. Had things continued as they had for thousands of years. You would have expected them to get second and third stories. They would have become over time more intense, more ornate. That's not what happened. After these were built, we had the Depression, we had World War II, and now we have a completely new style of development that skipped right over this, and we just started building miles and miles out on the edge. These places have been neglected for 90 years. 2 blocks over used to look just like this. We got it torn down, and now we have the new Taco John's. Double lane drive-through, parking lot, meets the sign ordinance, meets the floor area ratios. You've got, new sidewalks. You've got some native plants in the stormwater area. The problem, and nobody bothered to look at when this was built, that old and blighted block is worth $1.1 million. When this was built, that shiny and new block was only worth $800,000. Understand what you're looking at. You're looking at the traditional pattern of development, that incremental way we built cities for thousands of years, the kind of the core of your downtown, that approach. You're looking at it in its infancy after 90 years of neglect, and it still outperforms by a wide, wide margin the stuff we build brand new today. And we all know what happens to this stuff over time, right? Over time, these places don't tend to hold up very well. I've been to your community a few times, and I've seen many, many situations of those where they're boarded up, they're abandoned, they're looking for a grant or a tax subsidy to get them fixed. In fact, here's what happened in the few years after this was built. The city now collects 78% more property tax from that old rundown junky block than that shiny and new. Let me point out something kind of pernicious about your particular system here. When we look at that one on the right, let's look at the one on the left first. No impact fee, no permit fees, none of that revenue that you kind of depend on, and the county particularly depends on to make ends meet. On the right, you've got all that. You've got all that. So even though the tax, if this were in Florida, and we can find many situations of this exact thing happening here, even though you've actually devalued the wealth of the community, even though you've actually become poorer, and over the long term are going to struggle more because of it, this is a transaction that pays off for the local government. That is a really pernicious system, because there's actually an underlying incentive to do yourself damage over the long term in order to make ends meet in the short term. And I think you just have to be aware of that. When we look right now today, and I'm going to talk about transportation here in a second, but to me one of the more fascinating things about what is going on right here in this county is how through your impact fee system, you are basically taking money from the city of West Palm Beach and spending it to build literally the worst of the worst returning developments way out in the county. It's a crazy, insane system. You're taking your money out of your most productive place, not only allowing it to decline and degrade and become a more difficult place to run and manage, the stuff that you guys deal with all the time, but that money is then being siphoned off to invest in and subsidize this really, really negative returning type of development you see out on the edge.
Chuck, when we were talking earlier, you mentioned you were familiar with the study that Joe Minicozy did.
Yeah.
And I just want to remind the Commission, if you remember his presentation, talked about the high value of dense downtowns, and really echoing what you're saying here.
Joe and I did, in fact, let me, I'll show you this one real quick, and then I'm going to show you something Joe and I did together. Joe and I are really good friends and have worked on a lot of this stuff together. I'll just show you this one real quick because it kind of ties in. This is 20 acres on the left, out on the edge of town, the big box auto dealership, gas station, really the most valuable piece of property in the area. There's the 20 acres on the right of the core downtown. This is my hometown. My hometown downtown is... It is not a place any of you would go to take photos and hang out. It struggles a lot. Yet when we look at the two, what we see is a huge gap in the amount of wealth, the amount of tax revenue, the amount of long-term prosperity that are provided in each of these. This is your edge of town in your downtown, but the disparity there is 10x this. It's huge. This is a map that Joe and I put together, and we have a small enough room. I'm gonna ask this question here because it'll change slightly what I do. I've come to learn that 1.5% of the population is red-green colorblind, and so is not seeing this map the way that I see it. Joe and I Joe's team and I, we deal with accounting. So when you're in the green, you're making money. When you're in the red, you're losing money. Is there any, and it's perfectly fine, is there anyone in this room who's not seeing red and green? Don't look at each other, you can just look at me. Okay, then I'll assume that everybody here can see red and green. What we did in Lafayette was we took all these different maps we put together, the water map, the sewer map, the road map, the police coverage area map. We took, and all the maps of all their revenues. Here's where their sales tax is coming from. Here's where their property tax is coming from. We mashed these all together, and we came up with this essentially profit and loss statement for the city. Everywhere where you see green is a place where the city is bringing in more revenue each year compared to the expenses they have that are annualized. So take a road that would last 25 years, annualize those expenses, here's what that would be. Everywhere you see red is the opposite, where they're actually bringing in less money than what it costs them to provide service and maintain. And the higher the line goes, the more that disparity is. That core area right here, that's their core downtown. Now again, Lafayette's downtown. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Lafayette, Louisiana. They would ransom their firstborn children to have your downtown. This is a place that really, really struggles. Nobody goes to Lafayette and takes photos of the downtown and sends them home and says, look at this beautiful place. They do that here. They do that here. I have done that here. I have not done that in Lafayette. Okay? So, but you can see, even struggling, even kind of run down and neglected, their core downtown does tremendously well. I also want to point out one other thing. I'm going to walk over here off mic. This area right here, there's kind of a green crescent that runs through there. Those are the poor neighborhoods. Those are the poorest neighborhoods in the city. Those are the neighborhoods where when we were going there, and we're going to spend a week, a few different times working there, the city staff told us, don't get a place in those neighborhoods. That's where the homicides happen, that's where the burglaries happen, that's where the poor people live. Don't go there. Financially, it's doing incredible. Everything else on this map, all this that's red, that's your big box stores, your suburban mall, your chain restaurants, that's your windy subdivisions with the cul-de-sacs. That's what that is. This map shows two subsidies, and they're universal subsidies that we see everywhere around this country. In every city that we've ever modeled, subsidy number one, the poor neighborhoods subsidize the affluent neighborhoods. Very low service demand, very low infrastructure costs, very tight neighborhoods. Per acre, per lot, relatively low cost individually, but collectively very high amounts of revenue compared to the expenses. They're high return on investment places. When I look at West Palm Beach and I look at some of your poor, let me put it this way. I see a lot of energy in your core downtown. I see a lot of energy in your areas that you would say are places where affluent people live. And I get that, I understand that. I understand that there's a lot of growth potential there. And I understand that there's also a lot of money to grow those areas. But when I experience West Palm Beach, when I look at it and I look at some of your struggling neighborhoods, what I see is a ton of investment potential. These are places where tiny little bits of improvement show up right away on the ground, not only in the wealth from a tax-based standpoint, but in the wealth of the community, in actual family, small business wealth. And there's enormous investment potential there. The second subsidy is that future generations are subsidizing the present generation. In Lafayette, Louisiana, the median family pays $1,500 a year in taxes to the city. They'll pay other taxes to the parish and the school district, but $1,500 just to the city. In order for the city of Lafayette to make good on every promise shown in this map, median taxes would need to go from $1,500 to $9,200. 1 out of every $5 a family makes would need to get sent to the local government just to maintain the streets, the sidewalks, the pipes, the pumps, the valves, the meters, provide police protection, fire protection, and the services that they count on. Go ahead.
Commissioner Ryan?
Thank you. Just one quick question. So
Yeah.
what happens to the entire system if nothing is done in that core area? The green, the middle? Is it called Detroit? Where the entire system falls apart because the investment...
Okay, I was gonna say that. The problem with using the word Detroit is that everybody has an explanation for Detroit. I can go to all over the country and everybody has like a built-in explanation for Detroit that tracks with their own personal political perspective, core values, what have you. And really, the Venn diagram on our belief systems along Detroit, they have very little overlap. So everybody has an explanation for why we are not Detroit and why Detroit is different. This is Detroit. This is Detroit. When we look at Detroit, what we see is the first city to really experiment with the auto commuter system. Before that, cities grew incrementally up, incrementally out, and became incrementally more intense. There was outward expansion, but it was incremental. In the early 1900s, Detroit was the first to experiment with running highways through the middle of the city, building auto commuter suburbs out on the edge, and having people drive in every day, ripping down buildings to create parking. They were the first ones to do that. And when we hit the Great Depression in this country, what we saw is that cities everywhere did this. They tanked. Cities declared bankruptcy all over the place. Government struggled, laid off people. It was a nasty mess. Except where? Detroit. Detroit didn't do this. Detroit did this, but Detroit, grading on a curve was like the shining example through the Great Depression and World War II. And when we got done with World War II, there was one very obvious thing that we were going to do as a country. We were going to all follow in the footsteps of Detroit. We were going to adopt their development approach. We nationalized it. We created model zoning ordinances and handed them out to cities. We created national road and street standards and institutionalized them. We encouraged professional organizations like AASHTO and others to set up, here's the standard for replicating this model over and over and over again across the country. Here's the FHA that can finance it for you. Here's some government-sponsored entities, Fannie and Freddie ultimately, that can help finance these things. Here's insurance standards for how we can insure these things. We set this up all over to replicate that model again and again and again. Detroit is not some weird, strange place that's different than us. They're just 20, 25 years ahead of everybody else. That's what they are. And that's a hard thing to deal with because we don't feel at all like Detroit, right? But when we get all the studies that say, well, here's our backlog of road maintenance, and what do you do with it? You can't do anything with it. It's overwhelming.
Commissioner
That was where they were. Please.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this presentation. It's really fascinating. Detroit was successful for 90 to 100 years, and what's changed now, besides the automobile and the automobile being manufactured there, is also technology. So while we're using all of these historical revelations to figure out how to go into the future, how do you add to that? Because we can learn from these issues. We can learn from the things that people have done that were right at their time. I mean, that's part of the conversation that we have to have, is at that moment in time, that was the right thing to do. So we're in a different moment in time now.
Sure,
So how do we
correct.
add to the conversation what's happening globally, and I'm talking about environmentally globally, as
Right.
well as what's happening with technology and the future of the automobile? And I'm wondering if you're going to get to that spot anyway, and I'm fast
No,
forwarding,
not
and if I
really.
am.
No, I think it's a good question. I wasn't really planning to talk about that.
You are going to go into discussion about transportation, though, correct?
I'm going to talk a little bit about transportation,
Okay.
yeah. It's, when you look at this, you say, how do we solve this?
But what has to be solved?
Proportionate.
Well, here, what has to be solved is that there's no way that families will spend $1 out of $5, send $1 out of $5 to the government to maintain
To
stuff.
keep up the
Right.
radar.
And so what happens is that at some point in Lafayette, Louisiana, they're going to have to make a decision on what road do we fix and what road do we let fall
Right,
apart.
right.
What neighborhood do we invest in and what neighborhood do we let go? And really, that's the fundamental struggle that Detroit has had for the last 30 years. Are we going to allow this neighborhood to fall apart, or are we going to allow this neighborhood to fall apart? Because when you don't have money to do both, you pick between them. That's ugly. That's ugly. And what Detroit has struggled with that problem. In fact, I was in Detroit a few years ago and heard their mayor gave a talk, and the mayor said essentially no neighborhood left behind. That's an absurd policy. There is not the wealth to do that. I understand why that is a statement a politician would make. It's very, very hard to look at this neighborhood and say sorry, and this neighborhood and say well. But the reality is they don't have the wealth to do both. When I think about West Palm Beach, when I think about your community, the fascinating thing, and let me not talk about let me talk about this place here so we can talk about it in the abstract. If you were to ask people in Lafayette, just go ask people on the street, we got to pick one neighborhood over there, which one would you invest in? I can guarantee you they would not say the poor neighborhood. I can guarantee you they would not say the core downtown. They would say all the great stuff is happening out here. This is where the mall is, this is where all the investments are, this is where all the wealthy people are putting their money. And that would be like the worst investment they can make, the worst investment. So I think for us here, when we look at this community, I think to me the urgent need is to stop the bleeding. And by that I mean the actual taking of wealth that should be building this community up incrementally and shipping it out to the far exurbs to build the stuff that's bankrupting you. To me, that's like an urgent issue. That's a burning, urgent issue. Beyond that, you're going to...
So that goes back to our impact fees that are going...
I think your impact fees system needs to either go away or be changed and altered dramatically.
We agree. Commissioner James?
Thank you. And this is an insightful presentation, but counterintuitive.
Counterintuitive. I agree.
And I'm focusing now on what you've described as the poor neighborhoods.
Yeah.
When we had the presentation, I forget the gentleman's name before, it emphasized the downtown was more valuable because of the density opportunities. Now, it doesn't look like in the poorer neighborhoods you have the density.
Right.
So I'm struggling with why that is valuable.
But actually, you do have the density. If you think about the housing in the Northwest, for example.
I think it's a fantastic insight and observation. Joe and I have a little bit of nuance on this. Joe and I are best friends and professional colleagues. We work a lot together. We do have this little bit of nuance. Joe's an architect, and I think as an architect, he understands that when you stack floors on top of each other, and I think this is right out of his presentation, when you stack floors on top of each other, you're making money, which is true. Because I'm, as an engineer, look and say your cost is in the cost of the street. And the more wealth you get out of that street, the better off you are. Now, go to those green neighborhoods, the poor neighborhoods over there. What do you find? Because I went there and I walked around and I looked at this, like, why are we getting this? Well, the first thing you see is that the streets are kind of narrow. They're not the wide suburban streets. The streets are kind of narrow and simple. The sidewalks are there, but they're not like the big suburban sidewalks that nobody walks on. They're actual places where people walk. The houses tend to be built in a frugal, I'll use a Minnesota term, a frugal style. They're not horizontal to the street and wide. They're narrow to the street and deep. And what that does is that actually sets up a situation where each lot doesn't actually use that much infrastructure. So when we look and say, well, the density is not there, in a what I'm going to call a very brilliant historic kind of way, it actually is. If you look at it as how well are you utilizing the public investment. Those poor neighborhoods make really good use of the public investment. Now, I'll point out a couple other like little quirky things about Lafayette that I think is probably somewhat similar here, but maybe not. Those are the oldest neighborhoods. When the people first built in Lafayette, where did they build? Lafayette is a swamp. They built on the high ground. So one of the things we noticed in that neighborhood is that the sewage, when it runs out of the homes, runs by gravity down to the low spot and gets pumped to the treatment facility. If you're out here, we found a place out there where the sewage is pumped 23 times before it gets to that low spot and then pumped to the sewage treatment plant. They both pay the same bill. So if you say your revenue's the same, but this one has this much expense and this one has this much expense, you're losing money on this one out here. Now magnify that across roads and drainage and water, and you see, like, incrementally this all starts to add up. Please.
Go ahead.
Quick follow-up, Mayor. As elected officials, we have certain policy concerns.
Right.
It'd be nice if we could just do it by the numbers, by that. But the policy concerns, two things. One is, how do you avoid the downside of gentrification?
Right.
So if you take this logically to its extreme,
yes,
you would invest in these poor areas because there's a greater return on your investment. However,
yes,
it may lead to some unintended consequences called gentrification.
Yes.
The second thing is, how do you deal with absentee ownership? Because in many of those poor neighborhoods, I presume, the people who live there don't own the property. You probably have...
Yes.
So how do we deal with those policy realities?
I'm glad you asked the question. Those are those are very complex issues. I think both of your questions are combined. I'm going to try to take the second one first because I think it makes more sense if we do it that way. The absentee owner. One of the big differences between those neighborhoods today and the development pattern we saw prior to the Great Depression. Prior to the Great Depression, poor people generally owned their own place. They would be out on the edge, and it would be very small and modest, and it wouldn't have much service and utility, but they would own them. And if you think about that development pattern, if you think of a city growing incrementally out, incrementally up, and becoming incrementally more intense, if you moved to a town and you bought the little shack way out on the edge, you probably did a contract for deed because they didn't have 30-year mortgages. You worked really hard. You scrimped and saved to try to get into it. What would happen is, as the community grew, your property value, your underlying land value would grow, and the value of that property would grow, and you would share in that wealth. Today, what we've done is we've actually made these neighborhoods where the people who are living there don't actually own the properties. And they can't own the properties because you have to go through national mortgage standards to get them. Local banks don't finance them to people anymore. They'll do the transaction and sell them on a secondary market. We have to have, and this is a big thing that is hard for us to deal with. We actually have some local banking reform to help get poor people into ownership of the homes. Because the way we deal with gentrification is we grow incrementally. I think this is one of the biggest challenges that you have here particularly, because when the developers come in your community, they're not generally the type of incremental development where they're taking a single-family home, converting it into a duplex. If you take a single-family home in a poor neighborhood and convert it into a duplex, not only have you doubled the density, but you've made that property, probably 40-50% more valuable with the same pipe, the same road, the same everything. You haven't necessarily dislocated anybody. But if you come in and you take that single-family home and you convert it into a 4-story or 6-story condo unit, everybody who was there originally is gone, and it's a completely different neighborhood. From your fee structure, the condo unit's way more, way preferred. It's easier to permit, it's easier to approve, it's easier to process, it pays higher fees, everything about it is better. But the single-family home to the duplex conversion is the optimal way to go. If we can create a structure where people, by right, can incrementally improve their property, but not make huge leaps in the development pattern, we will be able to make investments over a broad area, over a long period of time, that don't dislocate people. And that's probably the hardest thing in a growing community, because the people coming to the table to make investments are going to say, you're going to deny, don't you want the growth? Don't you want this multi-million-dollar investment? And the reality is you do want a multi-million-dollar investment, you just want it in 50 properties by tiny increments, as opposed to one property with a huge increment. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. Now, I'm not sure the private sector is on board with that. It certainly makes sense. So who do we get to make those kind of incremental investments?
Let's say that we wanted to make that a priority. Let's say that as a commission, that was our priority. We want growth, we want investment, but we want it to be incremental. There's a handful of things that you can do. The first one is, I think you've got to look at your codes and your regulations and understand how they are tilted towards the big developer. And by tilted towards the big developer is going to say they're miserable, your codes and standards are horrible. Yeah, you have to be deep-pocketed to get through them. In Florida, particularly when you go through the whole system of development fees and impact fees, I was working in Martin County, and in Martin County, it takes 24 to 36 months to get an approval for a development. I saw once where they were just redoing like a gas station. This is something that should be simple. It took over 2 years to get the approvals. If you're a small developer, you don't have that level of risk time. So to me, I feel like you need to find, we need to find a way here to allow the next increment by right. And I'll tell you what I mean by right, and this is going to sound crazy and radical in your system, but if I have a single family home and I want to convert it to a duplex, if I have a business and I want to just do a slight intensity change to it, I should be able to walk in at 9 a.m. and walk out at noon with a permit to do that. If you turned around and said that to your staff today, I don't know if they would be able to process that as a directive, because the system here in Florida is so out of whack with that. If we could do that. Now, the second thing that I would do is, I think I see cities all the time where they say, well, our developers want to build this. And I said, well, I get that, because developers can make money doing that, and that makes sense. But they can also make money doing this. They're just not the kind of developer to do this, and this is what we want. You actually need different developers. And that's not to say that your current developers are bad or evil or we should get rid of them, but there's actually a group out there called the Incremental Development Alliance that is trying to train thousands of small developers around the country to do incremental projects profitably. And if you engage with them, They can come here, they can help train people who are underemployed or part-time employed. They can train people who want to leave their job and do development, do it on the side. There's a lot of people in your community who would fit that bill, who would like to do development work, but they need the skills and the training that a small developer has.
We have a couple of questions.
Please.
Commissioner Materia and then Commissioner Ryan.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think one of the cities that you would probably agree that has done a very good job at exactly what you're saying is Washington, D.C. They have, and one of the things that they did that I think we could learn from is, well, they did two things. They created a department for exactly that, so that it's separate of the department for bigger development, so that they can have a faster turnaround. But they also created a program by which they encouraged business ownership by the African American community. So that was growing as the housing stock was changing, and they didn't have exactly what you're talking about as far as the ability, because some of their most important neighborhoods are so historic that they couldn't really turn something into a duplex. So what they did is they gave them special compensations to be able to add a mother-in-law for a basement apartment.
Right.
And it did a lot of things. So one of the things it did is it kept the family together. And so it is now the city that has the most African-American owned businesses in our United States. And together, those two things, those two components, are part of, you can't talk about the gentrification without in a residential neighborhood without also talking about the businesses, because small businesses are actually the core of those neighborhoods. So I think what other cities are out there that you know of that we can learn something from, so that we're not reinventing the wheel?
Right now, along those lines, I think the city that is asking the best set of questions in this part of the world is Pensacola. I was in Pensacola twice last year, and one of the issues that they're dealing with is that in a lot of the poorer neighborhoods, they'll have commercial storefronts that are sitting vacant. I saw a couple today on my walk here. And the problem, as we dug into it, was that when people would go in to build in those, they were hit with 6-digit upgrades that needed to be done to meet building code and ADA compliance and sprinkling and all these things. And so what we have been working on there, and I think they're getting closer to implementing this, is a system that kind of turns that regulatory process around. It starts with the person and the building and the vision that they have for it. And the way that I kind of scope this out with them is that someone would go in and say, I have a building here, I have a business I would like to open up. And instead of going in and giving them, here's all the code violations, here's all the stuff that needs to be done, the first trip in there is to say, okay, let's make sure the roof is not going to collapse. Let's make sure there's not like bales of straw and cans of leaky cans of gasoline with like electric cords arcing over top of them. I mean, let's make sure that this is not like an obvious hazard. But let's put all these other things on the back burner. And let's give them 6 months to get this place up and running. Let's put a provisional seal outside so that if you're someone who, like, I'm not going to go in a place that hasn't met every inspection, we'll just put a seal on the door. But I'll tell you what, that will be a magnet for a lot of people who like funky places. And we'll say, 6 months later, we'll come back. How's your business doing? Is it viable? Is it working? Have you learned how to run this business? Because really, the first 6 months of running a business is figuring out how to make it work. It's taking your dream and putting it in reality. And if you have, then, if you're still there, then we sit down and say, okay, now let's go through and figure out what needs to be done. You need a sprinkler system. It's $120,000. You need to fix this door. That's going to be $10,000. We go through and we get all the things, and then we work with you. You have to take a certain percentage of your revenue and put it in an escrow account every month, and it builds up. And as you reach certain thresholds, that money gets spent making these repairs. So in other words, we grow the business first, and we use that growth in the business in these poor neighborhoods to then bring the building up to compliance. We don't try to do it the other way around. I think Pensacola is a really good model of flipping that thought process around.
We're about to launch a business incubator right here in our downtown for retail, food, whatever. And we received a grant from the Knight Foundation for $180,000. We're going to support them for 12 months and then help them move into their own spot after that.
Yeah.
Commissioner Ryan?
Thank you. The neighborhood just to the north of downtown is the Northwest neighborhood, which is in my district. It has historically been a single-family neighborhood. It has not transitioned for decades, and I have often looked to increasing the density, and that's been pushed back because of the fear of gentrification. So what I want to point out is that gentrification, like density, is not always a bad word. It's the process in which you go through. So when you take a single-family lot, which is not occupied by a homeowner, but is probably some absentee landlord that has rented the space, and increase that density, it goes into the pocket of the absentee landlord, which is not what people want to see happen, because they've not been good stewards of the property. But at the same time, there are families and people that do live within the community that do own their property. And by increasing the density, going from 1 unit to 2 or 1 to 3, though some of the absentee landlords may benefit from that, it really creates value for the family that has been gone for decades. When everybody moved out of that Northwest neighborhood, the capital that made that vibrant neighborhood went with it. And some have held on and have been waiting, and they're afraid that somebody will come in and tear up the entire community. And I've advocated, and I hope that after your presentation we can have this conversation, that we need to look at increasing density in a small-scale, incremental way in these communities that help add value to the people that have been there for a long time, and then, not supporting assemblages so that big development comes in and then displaces the rest. I mean, we can do this on an incremental basis that helps add the value to the community, and that word is density. So it's really hard to have this conversation when everybody's connotation is so negative. And I think that your presentation does a great job outlining how that value comes back to the core of where the services are needed, where the people are living, and where it can help support the balance of the community on the long term, because you're going to have to continue to pump to fix that road and so forth. So I hope your conversation here really sparks some conversation between us going forward.
I hope so too. I mean, the very difficult thing about gentrification is the opposite of investment in a neighborhood is disinvestment. And we don't want disinvestment. We also don't want dislocation. So how do we make incremental investment so that we're empowering people, we're improving quality of life, we're not walking away from neighborhoods, and we're allowing people to grow along with them? I think the only way you do that is incrementally.
Why don't you go on?
Please. I felt it was important, particularly with I used the term hallway earlier to describe the way your community sometimes is viewed, particularly when you look at the island and you look at the exurban areas and the flow in between. You to the outside world, West Palm Beach is sometimes like the hallway to get from one place you want to be to another place you want to be. And congestion in those corridors is a huge a huge topic of discussion, and I don't think congestion is really well understood. If you think of a river network, a stream network, we understand this very well. Small little brooks and streams run into larger creeks and rivers. Those will run into larger tributaries. We completely understand this kind of system. We understand that when we get rain out on the edge, we get an accumulation of water, we get flooding in the middle. This is so well understood. that we actually take steps out on the edge to handle the rainwater. You have to handle it on site. You can't run it off somewhere. We get this. We understand how devastating the flooding is, and so upstream we require people to take care of their water. If we look at a river of a different type, one of asphalt and concrete, it's not clear to me why we don't grasp the notion that if we get rain out on the edge and we channel everything in the same way, that we would not get flooding. Of course we get flooding. Like we totally get this. If you were trying to create the maximum amount of congestion possible, what would you do? You would take everybody possible to get in a car, you would channel them into the same place at the same exact time every day. That's why if you go to any city in the country, West Palm Beach, Brainerd, Minnesota, 13,500 people, we have a rush hour. It lasts like 5 minutes, but if you went out there during that 5 minutes and interviewed people, they would say the congestion here is unbearable. That's because we've taken every person possible and put them in the same place at the same exact time. And while we make a little bit of money off of this style of investment, we understand that the cost of this is enormous. The cost to you of Okeechobee is tremendous. It dwarfs whatever marginal increase in value is provided regionally for being able to run this wide hallway through the middle of your community. And I'll say that unashamedly. I think that, you know, when people in urban planning circles who are not from here talk about your city, they are, and I will include myself in this, incredibly impressed with what you have built. They're incredibly impressed with the things you have done. There's a lot here to admire, and there's a lot here to learn from. But everybody always comes back to Okeechobee Boulevard. Like, what is going on? Why in the middle of something so great would you do that? And I understand, I mean, I get it, I get the construct of it. But it's important to understand that you're actually not dealing with a problem that is solvable, and you're actually not dealing with it in a way that actually addresses it. When we look at the way we actually build and design our streets, what we have done, and I know you appreciate this, what we have done is we have imported into our cities a mentality that was put in place to deal with problems we were seeing on the open road. When you think about the way that our highways were originally built, you had the horse and buggy going through the woods, and when a horse and buggy got to a big tree, they would just go around. When it got to the big rock or the gully, it would just go around. So when we first started paving roads, putting high performance surfaces with high performance vehicles, what happened is that people were dying all over the place. They would come to, they just went out and paved what was there. When people would come to that corner, they would run into the rock. They would go down the gully. People were dying in horrendous numbers. And so engineers came up with this concept of forgiving design. The idea that we can actually design roadways to forgive the common mistakes that drivers make. So we got 2 lanes through the woods. People are going to float a little bit, so if we widen out the lanes, we're not going to have any collisions or head-ons. People have a little bit more room to work. If we widen out the shoulders a little bit, if someone loses control, they've got some room to get back on. If they go off the road, we don't want them to hit anything, so we get rid of the obstacles. And now we have a nice, safe, forgiving design. This is brilliant. It has saved probably millions of lives since it's been implemented. The only problem with it is, of course, when we bring this mentality into our core cities, what we find is that it doesn't work. We give people a false sense of security when they're driving. It's okay to drive fast. Speeds go up, and we get places that are inherently unsafe. At Strong Towns, we have a saying, if you need a sign to tell people to slow down, you designed your street wrong. When we look at a lot of your neighborhood streets, they're wonderfully designed. The speeds are low. They're not low in the sense that they're artificially low. They're neighborhood speeds. They feel very safe. A lot of your streets feel very, very safe. But there's parts of your community, and we can look at Okeechobee, we can look at some of your other main arterials going through, where the emphasis has been on speed, not on safety. The ideas of forgiving design have been misapplied. And what you have is an environment where you have high speeds with complexity. When we look at engineering manuals, what we see is that there's this trade-off between mobility and land access. And if we want to get this out of the engineering speak, we can talk about it as getting someplace or being in a place. And engineers describe this as, you can have mobility, a lot of mobility, and not much access, and we call that arterial. You can have a lot of access, but not much mobility. We call that a local street. Or you can have your cake and eat it too. That's this middle part here we call the collector, where you can have a lot of access and a lot of mobility. We'll just balance them out. When we look at these financially, we can build great. The turnpike I was on, what's this called? The one I rode down from our
Florida Turnpike.
That is a brilliant piece of engineering. It is a fantastic. I mean, I don't know if you all hate it or love it. I love it. Yes, you got to pay tolls, but there's no people getting on and off. There's no complexity. You just get on that thing and you go a long distance. It's a brilliant piece of engineering. It's a beautifully designed road. We can actually build those things very cost effectively. So you can move a lot of people a lot of distance in a short period of time. When we get to this end of the spectrum, a lot of your community fits in with this. We emphasize the place over getting through the place. We can do that very cost effectively too. Our investments pay off. They get development intensity and they pay off. It's this middle part here where we spend lots of money and we get very low returns. This is that place where we build the Taco John's and the big box stores. This is that area there. Incidentally, this stuff here is also very safe. When you're on the Florida Turnpike, it's incredibly safe. You can go long distances at very low collision rates. When we're in neighborhoods going at very slow speeds, we might have a lot of fender benders, but we don't have a lot of people dying. But it's in this part here where we've got cars driving at speed, where we also add complexity and turning movements, cars parking, cars turning, people walking across the street, people walking along the street, bikes, wheelchairs. That's where we have all our collisions. That's where we have all our fatalities. What we have done at Strong Towns is take this and flip it on its side and say, at what speed do we create the most value? At what speed do we create the most value? What we see is when we're at very low speeds and very high speeds, we create a lot of value in the community. If we can get a corridor where you're driving 60 plus miles an hour, or we can get a corridor where you're driving 15 miles an hour or less, we're creating lots of value. It's that middle part. It's that middle part in there, this part we call a strode, where we're trying to get high speeds and wealth creation that we get neither. This is something that we call a strode. A strode is a street-road hybrid. We call this the futon of transportation. If you think about a futon being an uncomfortable couch that also is an uncomfortable bed, a strode tries to be both a street and a road at the same time, and it fails at both of them. A street is a platform for building wealth. And if we look at this strode, we can see that we've put in wide sidewalks, decorative lights, banners, all this stuff to try to build the tax base up. But the tax base fails. Cars are moving through too quickly. People don't feel like they can cross. They get in their cars, they drive. You wind up with a return on investment that's more like that Taco John's. People put in drive-throughs and parking lots, and your return on investment goes way down. A road is about moving people places. You can think of a road as a replacement of the railroad. You get on at one spot, you get off on another. There's a high-speed connection between the two. We've made a massive investment to move cars quickly here. You've got 4 highway-scaled lanes. You've got a center turn lane to get the turning traffic out of the way. Does anyone get to move quickly through here? No. You've got traffic signals, make you go 0. You've got low speed limits, make you go very slow. Even though we've made a massive investment in mobility, nobody moves very fast here. When I look at Okeechobee, it drives me nuts because you've created this massive amount of capacity to move vehicles quickly, and at every instance you stop them. You stop them. You would be better off having 1/3 the capacity of lanes, slowing the traffic down and getting rid of your signals, and just having cars flow through slowly. You would get more traffic through in quicker amounts of time at slower neighborhood speeds.
How do we convince FDOT of that?
That's like $1 million question.
Yeah.
I'll give 2 quick responses to
Yes,
it.
if you have an answer, you could be really rich, right?
No, I'll give 2 quick answers to it. One, there are people in FDOT who get that, and they're starting to have more of a voice. Institutionally, it's a messed up organization. They're starting to get more of a voice internally. But number 2, I think, is even more important, and I think even more hopeful, while at the same time being really scary. FDOT is broke. It is functionally insolvent. Your Department of Transportation is one of the most bankrupt DOTs in the country. If you take the amount of lane miles they have pledged to maintain, and you take every revenue source they could possibly get, the gap between those two is astounding. It's enormous.
And there's still one, I mean, we're fighting them over a road through our water catchment area, a 4-lane high-speed highway that goes nowhere. But they apparently have the money to build it and maintain it.
They don't. It's called institutional inertia. In the next decade, Florida DOT is going to have an aggressive policy to turn back highways to counties and cities. I suspect that in the next 10 to 15 years, they will come to you with a proposal to give you Okeechobee Boulevard. There is no reason why that should be a state highway, first of all. You just look at it on the map, it doesn't get you anywhere. It's a local street. They will try to give it to you. I think that is in the future. Please.
I just want to answer your question. I think the importance that most people put on these roads is evacuation in the event of hurricanes. So
right.
Where they're going is to the neighborhoods in the west and to the communities in the east, but the importance of them really comes down to moving a lot of cars quickly in an emergency situation to get you onto 95 or to get you to the turnpike. So those are issues that when we look to slow things down and we look to reduce the Strode effect, that's a factor that gets thrown back at us in terms of what happens in an emergency.
I'm assuming you've been in those emergencies.
Yes.
How fast does traffic go?
Depends on how early you leave.
Right, but I mean in the peak that you're trying to deal with, how fast does it go?
It stops.
It doesn't go fast.
It stops.
It stops. It doesn't go fast. This is not a size of pipe problem. It's a valve problem. You can, this is the maddening thing. We treat this as if it's a size of pipe problem. What it really is, it is a, particularly you here now with what you're dealing with, it is a issue of the signals and the way everything's configured, basically artificially stopping the flow of traffic. If you, I've not done this analysis here, but I've done it in other places. If you actually cut the speeds down to 15 miles an hour, so cut the speed in half of what it's posted. I think, what is it, is it posted at? It's posted at 45?
Yeah.
Okay, cut it to 20. Go down the number of lanes.
I think we should do that with all the streets downtown.
But get rid of the signals.
Yeah, we can't. That's the county.
But I'm saying, if you got rid of the signals and allowed traffic to just flow, so a shared space intersection or some type of traffic circle, something along those lines, what you would find is that at all hours, traffic would flow more smoothly.
How do people get across the street?
People walking?
Yeah.
They would just walk across the street.
If there's no street lights or anything?
Traffic would be very slow. How do you walk across a parking lot? Traffic is very slow. You just walk. People stop.
Commissioner Moffett, you had a question.
Thanks. That was sort of my question. So I love the idea of slowing traffic, and I agree that we have to, if we were to do something like that in Okeechobee, we would have to cut down lanes. But what the mayor said is a question that I have is cross traffic across Okeechobee. Right now when you're on it and you're going 45 miles an hour, even to stop it at, or slow down to 20, I don't see a gap in order to have cross traffic work. How do you deal with that?
Are you talking about people walking or people driving?
People driving.
Okay. If you had shared space intersections, or I'll give you one thing to go look at. There's on YouTube, there's a video I'd like you to watch called Poynton Regenerated, Poynton.
Say it again, I'm sorry.
Poynton Regenerated.
Just before you go on,
Yeah.
I need to leave.
Yeah, no, I
And
know.
you're welcome to stay. Commissioner Materio, if you will take over running this meeting. Commissioner Nearing's not here, so you're elected.
Thank you.
And I'll see you later.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I know we have to get to the chamber by noon too, so we're short timers too. That video shows an intersection with over 40,000 cars a day going through it before and after. Before is signalized, after is non-signalized.
Say the name again.
Poynton, Poynton, and then regenerated is the second word. And if you look at this, it's a long video. It's like 18 minutes, but they show the whole construction process. They interview people before, they interview people after. You get a good sense of the fears and concerns. Now, this is a European place, so there's not a direct correlation here, although I will tell you there are many cities in the U.S. who are starting to work on this very similar process. What you find is that from a traffic standpoint, the cross traffic is, right now what our intersections do is they privilege one set over another. So you wait your turn and then you're privileged, and then you wait your turn and then you're privileged. What a shared space does, and really what a traffic circle does, is everybody's equally privileged. So you walk out into the intersection, you have just as much right to be there as the car, everybody yields to everybody. It's a much more humanizing space. But it has the side effect of actually having things flow more smoothly and reducing travel time. I'm going to finish up with just a couple quick observations. We are working right now in the United States to find money to do transportation. I talked a little bit about your impact fees and how they are funding kind of the lowest returning, most expensive kind of transportation in your region. If you can find a way to keep that money here and use it on your own transportation systems, I think one key strategy is got to be eliminating your stroads, converting them into either streets or roads. From a technical standpoint, from an engineering standpoint, this is a really easy thing to do. Where it's difficult, and I think you'll all recognize this right away, is that culturally it becomes much harder. This is a conversation we're having now. So if you want to go from a stroad to a street, you slow traffic, you prioritize people over vehicles, you focus on the development potential of the adjacent property. If you want to go from stroad to road, you limit access. You try to make it more like the turnpike where you're getting through. So you're separating your people and bikes and what have you. You're having separate facilities for them. And you're not mining that capacity for development. You're actually trying to limit development in those areas. When we look at our models, and we go out and we look at those places that are green, we look at those places that have the highest return on investment, what we see in every single one of them is people. People we call the indicator species of success. If you deal with ecology, ecologists will go out and look at an environment and they're looking for certain indicator species, and if those species are there, they know that everything else around is probably pretty healthy. In cities, it's people. People outside of their car, walking around, people in the space. If you go out, one of the tests we say, if you go out at noon on a street, do you see more people than cars? And if you do, that place financially is doing really well. People are like a rough indicator. Last concept, and then we'll just talk about whatever you want to talk about. Complete streets, I think, is a great concept that responded to an obvious problem that no one was paying attention to. I remember when in the 90s, complete streets started to seep into our engineering conversations. It's a very kind of American concept. Everybody gets something. You know, if you're biking, you get a place. If you're walking, you get a place. If you're in transit, you get a place. If you're driving, you get a place. Like I say, it's like Oprah. You know, you get a place, you get a place. Everybody gets a place. It's a very American concept. And when it first I first started seeing it, the engineers that I worked with hated this idea. But then they realized two things. First, they could get paid more for doing it, which was, everybody likes that. Second, it didn't really compromise any of the values of the engineering system. It didn't change the way they actually designed their systems. Complete streets accommodate pedestrians, which is what engineers call people. Complete streets accommodate pedestrians within an auto-dominated environment. If we actually want to get to something that's safe, something that's productive, something that is strong, we have to switch that around and say productive places accommodate automobiles in an environment dominated by people. It's people that build wealth. It's people that make value in a place. It's people that meet and form businesses and fall in love and make a place really work. My greatest memories of being here is being in hordes of people enjoying themselves on a regular weekday here in West Palm Beach. And I do think that that is part of what makes this community special, and I think seeing that spread is going to be a key to your success. So that's all I've got, and I'm happy to, I don't know how long it's going to take us to get to the chamber. Okay, so we've got like 5. Go ahead, please.
So, Commissioner Materio mentioned Washington, D.C., which is where I'm from and grew up, and I've always had this fantasy that on Okeechobee Boulevard, we were going to take the tent site and put DuPont Circle, so that all those cars that are going into 15 different locations to the north, to the south, to the east, to the west, they have that ability to flow in a more natural way. Of course, that's not been an accepted concept, but still, my question to you is, when you look at Okeechobee Boulevard and you look at this Strode, you know, what are some of the engineering things that we can do to kind of move people out of the way so that those that are going, you know, in this instance, to the island, because they're coming up from the west and their destination is on the complete other side of downtown? Are there concepts to
You're the hallway.
Yeah.
Let me try to answer it this way. I think the short answer is yes, there's a lot of concepts. Second, I've seen some of them. I know you've had some of them prepared. I know people have put together alternate plans for this. I think the DuPont Circle image in your head is a good one, is not a bad one at all. I think the point and regenerated one is probably 3 steps beyond what is probably today considered possible, but maybe it's an anchor point you start with as a way to get to something that you could agree on. There's a lot of brilliant people who have weighed in on that. I want to say that Victor's group did a design of it. Dover Cole actually looked at it once. I am a horrible designer compared to these people. So there's a lot of genius people who have looked at this situation. I think if you start with the notion that what's there now is completely unacceptable, and also the realization that it does more harm to the region than it does good, to me, those are 2 starting points to have a conversation where you can create some common ground with people. You want people to get through there without being held up. You want traffic to flow. You want people to be able to get through there. But you don't want it to destroy or leave a huge moat in the middle of your community. Those should be things we can all agree on. And I think you can improve travel times while also improving the quality of life here.
Commissioner James, do you have a question?
Thank you. And I know this has been toward mobility, but I want to go back to some of your earlier comments. And you don't have to answer it now, but maybe you could point me to some place, because one element that's been missing, certainly in West Palm Beach and Palm Beach County, is affordable housing. Mm-hmm. And how do we get there? What models are there that we can use? Particularly, you talked about the incremental, right? And that may be one way to do it, but I'm not sure that supply will be sufficient to meet the demand that we have here in West Palm Beach. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, is a very difficult issue. We're actually going to do at Strong Towns, and I know this is an insufficient answer to your question. Starting in April, May, we're devoting those 2 months to talking about that issue on our site. And we publish 3 posts a day. We do 2 podcasts a week. If you're interested in getting a bunch of different perspectives on it, the way that we're approaching it is that there really is it's not a problem with a simple answer. And I also don't think it's a problem with a universal answer. So I'm hesitant to give you what I think is the answer, because I've seen places do it differently. I, in my heart, am not a fan of the rent control approach. I'm also not a fan of the subsidize developers by giving them more density kind of approach. And my 2 problems with both of those is that I don't see them scaling. I see them being an approach that politicians can agree on, and that it looks like you're doing something to the public. But in places where I've seen those put into effect, the rent control serves to help people who are there now as long as you don't move, and they tend to lock. This is my impression. They tend to lock poorer people in place when they should have more opportunity to dynamically move and find opportunity. I think it encourages people to be stuck in place, which is unhealthy. I think the idea of paying developers either to the direct subsidy or with a density bonus to include affordable units is something that they're doing in Seattle, they're doing in Portland, they're doing in San Francisco, where they have huge affordable housing problems. They don't scale. It builds 3-4% of the units that they actually need. If you ask me, without an intimate knowledge of the neighborhoods, to me, I think the incremental development approach is, I think what you have is a supply-demand problem. You don't have enough supply to meet the demand. The way you lower prices, you increase supply. You increase supply in towers, you're going to get a weird price point, and you're going to crash the rest of the stuff. What you want to do is you want to incrementally increase supply over time. That's an inadequate response for someone who needs a house today. And I have the luxury of standing up here not being that person, so I can say this in a theoretical sense. So I'm not going to pretend to know the exact answer or tell you what to do, but I think if you start down this incremental path, it will make whatever you do an easier thing to handle. Ideally, you have people who need homes. You have people who need cheaper homes. You have lots of people who are underemployed. The thing about the incremental development approach that I really like is you marry those together. Let's get people who are underemployed but skilled. Let's get them working. And maybe they're fixing up a house in the evening. That's an incremental developer. They can still have their job during the day doing whatever, but they got this side project going on. That's filling housing units in your community. That has been a long, historic way that people who are poorer were able to work and make something out of nothing. And we've outlawed it today. We make it not possible. And I think we have to make it possible again, because it will benefit the neighborhood. It will benefit people who are willing to work and want to work, which, when I visit neighborhoods, people who are underemployed say, I want a job, I want to work, I want to do this. Let's empower them to make their neighborhood better.
Where do they get land?
The land's sitting right there.
Yeah, there's houses.
No, it's single-family homes. Let's get them in there and let them convert it into a duplex. Let's convert it into a triplex. Let's let them, make that investment. So now you're talking about how you get the capital. The incremental development people, that Incremental Development Alliance, that's their specialty. And they will tell you, the Hyatt I stayed at last night, whoever built that thing was rich to begin with, okay? What we want is people to be able to build land and develop who are not already rich. The Incremental Development Alliance people will help them understand how to get capital in a way where you All you need is the ability to work hard and the desire to do it. You don't need deep pockets. And to me, that's the huge shift. Because right now, I'll say this, and I say this kindly, West Palm Beach is being built by wealthy people. That's it. You have to be wealthy to build here, period. And because of that, the only market for people who are not wealthy are essentially like the rundown hand-me-downs that used to be places for wealthy people. I'm not against wealthy people, and I welcome them to come in and make investments where they meet the goals of your community. But I think you've identified an unmet need, and you're looking to a current class of developers to meet that need. They're not going to meet that need. It's not, they're not that kind of developers. You have to find a different kind of developer to meet that need. And if you get them, you have the capital, you have the land, you have the property, you have the people, you have the wherewithal. You just need to develop it.
So we're going to take one more question from Commissioner Moffett.
Okay.
Thank you. So I know we've talked about Okeechobee, and I'm glad you stayed at the Hilton.
Yeah.
Because it's next to the convention.
Was it the Hyatt or the Hilton?
I did say the Hyatt, I'm sorry.
pardon me,
Did I
pardon
say Hilton?
No, you might have said Hyatt.
said
I heard
Hyatt,
Hilton.
yeah.
Okay. So that's great, you stayed at Hyatt. But anyway, Hilton is on Okeechobee. It's right next to our convention center.
I've stayed there before too.
Okay.
Yes.
So when we have huge amounts of people now coming to the convention center, which is great.
Yep.
Tony Robbins, for instance, attracts thousands of people.
Yep.
They all want to cross Okeechobee to go to City Place.
Yes.
At one point they will. And so I guess my question to you is I would like your thoughts on pedestrian bridges, particularly there.
But I'm going to interrupt for a second before you answer the question. I want you to think of that as a gateway.
I think pedestrian bridges on their face are offensive to me. And I don't, you're asking me my opinion. I'm saying this, if you're all vested in a pedestrian bridge, I wouldn't, to me, they're patently offensive. They say people don't belong here. Street level. I mean, if you have a highway and you have a pedestrian bridge over top that connects this neighborhood to this, like, I totally get that. But for a city street, for a street running right through the middle of the street of the city, a pedestrian bridge is like a big middle finger to everyone who lives in your community. It's saying, like, we value this hallway and the people going through this hallway way more than we value anyone here who would cross, or any value created by this crossing. I think they're just patently offensive on their surface, on the face. I also think that they're not going to be used. You put a pedestrian overpass there, no one will use it. People will, I mean, if you go online and just type in Google, like pedestrian overpass, you know, people crossing the street or something, you will see image after image after image of where the engineers, the designers who care about through traffic would say, those darn pedestrians are screwing everything up, let's create a bridge for them. And what happens? Everybody walks on the street underneath the bridge. It would not get used. It's not the right solution. I think it would be a horrible mistake.
Okay, is that it? Anybody else have anything else? And thank you very much. We really
Thank you.
appreciate this.